The first time Cedar Bend had run Dexter Dawson out of town, they had done it with stones, curses, and a rope that never quite found his neck, only because the young preacher had begged them to show mercy. The second time he rode toward those same weathered rooftops, 6 years later in the autumn of 1881. It was not vengeance that pulled him back, but the sound of a woman screaming for help on the lonesome Colorado road. He heard her before he saw her, a high, frightened cry carried on the wind that smelled of sage and impending rain, and he turned his sorrel gelding off the trail without a moment's hesitation, spurring toward a stand of cottonwoods where a buggy lay tipped on its side in a shallow gully. The horse that had been pulling it was gone, spooked clean out of its traces, and a young woman was pinned beneath the crushed wheel, her skirts tangled in the splintered wood, her face pale with pain and dust. "Hold still," Dexter called out, swinging down from his saddle before the gelding had even come to a full stop. "I've got you, just hold still now." She looked up at him with wide brown eyes, and for a moment her fear seemed to war with something else, a flicker of hope that a stranger had appeared out of nowhere on an empty road at dusk. "My ankle," she gasped. "I think it is broken. Please, I cannot move the wheel myself." He knelt beside her, testing the weight of the buggy with careful hands, and found that if he braced his shoulder beneath the axle he could lift it just enough. "When I say go, you pull yourself free. Do not try to stand on that leg." "I understand." He set his boots wide in the dirt, drew a breath, and heaved upward with every muscle in his back and arms straining against the splintered oak. "Now," he grunted, and she dragged herself clear with a cry of pain, rolling onto the grass as he let the buggy fall back with a crash that sent a startled jackrabbit bolting into the brush. For a moment neither of them spoke. Dexter Dawson, 30 years old, sun-worn and lean from years of wandering, looked down at the young woman he had just pulled from beneath a wrecked buggy, and something in his chest tightened in a way he did not have a name for. "Thank you," she said softly, pressing a hand against her ankle, which was already swelling beneath her stocking. "I do not know what I would have done if you had not come along." "You would have waited for the next fool with a horse," he said, offering her the ghost of a smile. "Lucky for you, I happened to be riding this way." "Where were you riding to?" He hesitated, and his gaze drifted past her shoulder toward the distant rooftops and the white steeple of the church, all of it exactly as he remembered, exactly as it had looked the last time he had seen it through a haze of bruises and shame. "Cedar Bend," he said finally, the name feeling strange and heavy in his mouth after so many years of refusing to speak it aloud. "That is my home," she said. "I am Susanna Sutton. My father is the town doctor. If you would be so kind as to help me back there, I promise you will be well rewarded for your trouble." Dexter studied her a long moment, the dust on her cheek, the determined set of her jaw despite the pain plainly written across her face, and he thought of every reason he had to turn his horse the other direction and ride on toward some other town where nobody remembered his name with contempt. But there was something about the way she had looked at him, without suspicion, without the wariness he had grown so used to seeing in strangers' eyes, and he found he could not simply leave her sitting in the dirt. "Name's Dexter Dawson," he said, and watched carefully to see if the name meant anything to her. It did not even a flicker of recognition, and something in him eased just slightly. "I reckon I can get you there faster on my horse than waiting on that buggy to be fixed. I would be grateful." He lifted her as gently as he could manage, feeling the fragile weight of her against his chest, the warmth of her breath against his collar, and settled her carefully onto his saddle before swinging up behind her. She stiffened at the closeness, but the pain in her ankle seemed to outweigh any impropriety, and she allowed herself to lean back against him as he nudged the gelding into a slow, careful walk toward the town that had once thrown stones at him. "You are not from around here," Susanna said after a while, glancing back at him. "Not anymore," he answered and left it at that. The sun was low and orange by the time they reached the edge of Cedar Bend, the same dusty main street lined with the same clapboard buildings, though a few new ones had sprung up in the years he had been gone. A mercantile with fresh paint. A second saloon. A bank with iron bars across its windows that had not been there before. People turned to look as Dexter rode in with Susanna Sutton cradled against him, and he felt the weight of their stares settle on his shoulders like something physical, a burden he had carried away from this town once before and had never quite managed to set down. "There," Susanna said, pointing toward a modest house with a shingle reading Dr. Sutton and hanging from a porch post. "That is my father's house." Before Dexter could bring the horse to a stop, the front door burst open, and an older man with graying whiskers and spectacles came hurrying down the steps, his medical bag already in hand as though some instinct had told him his daughter was in danger. "Susanna, my God, what happened?" "My ankle, Papa. The buggy overturned. This man saved me." She looked back at Dexter with something warm in her eyes that made his chest ache in a way he had not felt in a very long time. "I do not even know how to thank you properly, Mr. Dawson." Dr. Sutton's eyes snapped up at the name, and Dexter watched the recognition dawn slowly across the older man's face, saw him searching his memory for a face that had been younger, thinner, more frightened. "Dawson," the doctor repeated quietly. "Dexter Dawson. That's right." A crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion, and among them Dexter recognized faces that had not changed nearly enough in 6 years. The blacksmith, Otis Greer, who had once held him down while others struck him. The mercantile owner's wife, who had spat at his feet. And striding through the gathering crowd with his thumbs hooked into his gun belt, Sheriff Cole Barrow, the very man who had put a boot to Dexter's ribs and told him if he ever showed his face in Cedar Bend again, they would not bother with a trial. "Well, I'll be damned," Barrow said, stopping a few feet from the horse, his hand resting meaningfully near his revolver. "Dexter Dawson, didn't figure you'd be stupid enough to ride back into this town." "Sheriff," Dexter said evenly, sliding down from the saddle and helping Susanna into her father's waiting arms, "I found Miss Sutton in trouble on the road. I was only bringing her home. That true, Susanna?" Barrow asked, though his eyes never left Dexter. "It is true," she said firmly, wincing as her father helped her toward the porch steps. "He saved my life, Sheriff Barrow. The buggy had me pinned. If he had not come along, I do not know how long I might have lain there." Barrow's jaw worked as though he were chewing on something bitter. "Well, I suppose we owe you thanks for that much." He spat the word thanks as though it cost him something dear. "But do not mistake that for an invitation to stay. Cedar Bend does not want your kind here, Dawson. Never did." "My kind," Dexter repeated softly, and old anger flickered behind his eyes, banked but never quite extinguished. "You mean a man falsely accused." "I mean a horse thief," Barrow snapped, and the gathered crowd murmured its agreement, old prejudices rekindled as easily as dry kindling catching flame. "Silas Crane lost 2 of his finest stallions the year you left, and you were the only stranger in town that season." "I never touched Crane's horses, and you know it in your bones, Sheriff. You just never wanted to look past the easiest answer." Dexter's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it, the accumulated weight of 6 years spent carrying an accusation he had never deserved. "But I did not come back to relitigate old business. I came because a woman needed help, and I gave it. That is all." Dr. Sutton, who had been examining his daughter's ankle with careful, practiced hands, looked up sharply. "The ankle is not broken, only badly sprained, thank the Lord, but Susanna will need to stay off it for at least a week." He straightened and regarded Dexter with an expression that was not quite trust but was not hostility either. "Mr. Dawson, whatever happened here years ago, you did my daughter a great kindness today. I will not forget it." "Doc," Barrow said warningly. "I am simply stating a fact, Sheriff." The doctor's voice carried the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed in matters of life and health. "The man saved my daughter's life. I think we can extend him the courtesy of a meal and a night's rest before he continues on his way, can we not?" Barrow's face reddened, but the crowd had begun to shift, uncertain now, the doctor's words settling like a counterweight against the old sheriff's grudge. Susanna looked at Dexter with gratitude shining plain in her eyes, and for the first time since he had ridden back into Cedar Bend, he felt something other than the old bitterness stirring in his chest. "I will not stay where I am not wanted," Dexter said quietly. "I have camped under worse skies than this one, but I thank you for the offer, Dr. Sutton." "Nonsense," Susanna said, struggling to sit up straighter despite her father's protests. "You will at least eat with us tonight. I insist. It is the very least we can do." Barrow looked as though he wanted to argue further, but the crowd was already beginning to disperse, their appetite for confrontation dulled by the doctor's calm reasonableness and the obvious debt owed to the stranger who had rescued Susanna Sutton. The sheriff settled for a final, hard glare before turning on his heel and stalking back toward his office, muttering something about keeping an eye on things. That evening, Dexter Dawson sat at a table in Dr. Sutton's modest kitchen for the first time in 6 years, eating a meal in Cedar Bend that had not been thrown at him or denied him outright. Susanna sat across from him, her injured foot propped on a stool, watching him with open curiosity as her father ladled stew into wooden bowls. "You must think us a terrible town," Susanna said finally, breaking the awkward silence. "The way they treated you out there." "I think some folks form their opinions quick and hold to them stubborn," Dexter said carefully. "Doesn't mean the whole town's rotten. Your father seems a decent sort." "He is the best man I know," Susanna said with obvious affection. "We came to Cedar Bend only 4 years ago, after my mother passed in Missouri. I do not know the history you carry with this place, Mr. Dawson, but I can see it weighs on you." Dexter set down his spoon, considering how much to say. There was something in Susanna's steady gaze that invited honesty in a way he had not experienced in a long while, not since before the accusation had turned him into a wandering man with no place to call his own. 6 years back, a rancher named Silas Crane lost 2 prize stallions. I was passing through, looking for work, and I was the only stranger in town, so naturally I became the only suspect worth considering. Never mind that I had no horses of my own to smuggle them away on. Never mind that Crane's own foreman had motive enough to steal from his employer and blame it on a drifter with no family to defend him. His voice had grown quiet, but the old pain was still there, sharp as a blade beneath the calm surface. "They dragged me to the town square, beat me, nearly hanged me before the preacher intervened. Told me if I ever came back, they would finish the job properly." Susanna's face had gone pale as he spoke, her hand pressed to her mouth. "That is monstrous. Papa, did you know of this?" Dr. Sutton, who had been quietly eating his own stew, set down his spoon with a troubled expression. "I had heard whispers of it when we first arrived, though nobody spoke of it plainly. Crane still runs the largest ranch in the valley. Folks do not care to cross him, even in memory." He looked at Dexter with something like shame coloring his features. "I am sorry, son. Whatever happened here, it was not justice. It was cowardice dressed up as it." "I did not come back to dig up old wounds," Dexter said. "I only meant a pass-through on my way toward the mining camps up in the mountains. I have no interest in staying where I am not welcome." "You are welcome at this table," Susanna said firmly, and there was something in the way she said it, some quiet conviction, that made Dexter look up and meet her eyes properly for the first time all evening. "Whatever this town did to you, I had no part in it, and I will not pretend it did not happen simply to keep the peace." Something shifted between them in that moment, something neither of them could quite name yet, but Dexter felt it settle into his chest like a warm stone, and for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, he did not feel entirely alone in the world. He stayed camped that night at the edge of town, near the creek that ran behind the Sutton house, unwilling to accept the doctor's offer of a bed inside, but unable to bring himself to ride away just yet. He told himself it was only because Susanna's ankle would need tending, and he wanted to be certain she was well before he left. He told himself many things that night, lying beneath the stars with his saddle for a pillow, but none of them quite explained why his heart had beat faster when she had smiled at him across that kitchen table. The days that followed unfolded slowly, like a rope uncoiling. Dexter found small jobs to occupy himself, mending fences for a rancher who did not recognize him, splitting firewood for a widow who paid him in biscuits and buttermilk, careful always to avoid the center of town where Sheriff Barrow's watchful eyes tracked his every movement. But each evening, as the sun dipped low over the western ridges, he found his feet carrying him back toward the Sutton house, where Susanna would be waiting on the porch, her ankle healing steadily, her company growing more precious to him with each passing day. "You did not have to bring these," Susanna said one evening, examining the small bundle of wildflowers he had gathered along the creek bank, purple asters and goldenrod woven together with a length of grass. "Thought they might brighten up that porch some," Dexter said, feeling suddenly foolish, a grown man of 30 blushing over flowers like some green schoolboy. "They are lovely." She lifted them to her nose, breathing in their faint, earthy sweetness. "Nobody has brought me flowers before, Mr. Dawson." "Seems an oversight on somebody's part," he said, and she laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that made something in his chest loosen further. "Please," she said, "you must call me Susanna. After everything, Miss Sutton feels far too formal between us." "Susanna, then." He tested the name on his tongue and found he liked the shape of it. "And I suppose you had better call me Dexter." "Dexter," she repeated softly, and the way she said it, careful and warm, made him wonder if perhaps some good might yet come of returning to this town he had sworn never to see again. They talked for hours those evenings, about her childhood in Missouri before her mother's illness had taken her, about her father's dream of building a proper hospital in Cedar Bend someday, about the books she loved to read by lamplight when sleep would not come. Dexter found himself speaking more freely than he had in years, telling her of the ranches he had worked across 3 territories, the herds he had driven up from Texas, the quiet solitude of nights spent beneath open skies with only the stars and his horse for company. He did not speak of the loneliness that solitude had cost him, but he suspected she understood it anyway, some quiet recognition passing between them that needed no words. It was on the 9th evening, as autumn's chill began creeping into the mountain air, and the aspens along the ridgeline had turned to gold, that Dexter first heard the names that would change everything. He had ridden out to the eastern range that afternoon, tracking a stray calf that belonged to the rancher he had been working for, and as dusk settled over the hills, he found himself passing near a narrow box canyon he remembered from his youth, a place where cattle rustlers had once hidden stolen stock before driving them north to sell. He had not thought of the place in years, but something made him rein in his horse at the canyon's mouth, some old instinct sharpened by years of careful living, and he heard voices carried faintly on the evening wind. He dismounted quietly, leaving his gelding tied to a scrub pine, and crept forward along the canyon rim until he could look down into the shadowed hollow below. 5 men sat around a small fire, their horses picketed nearby, rifles stacked within easy reach, and at the center of them, gesturing with the confident authority of a man accustomed to command, was a face Dexter recognized despite the years that had passed and the beard that now covered his jaw. Bart Higgins, Silas Crane's former foreman. The very man Dexter had always suspected of stealing those stallions 6 years ago and laying the blame at a stranger's feet. "The bank will be flush with cash come Saturday," Higgins was saying, his voice carrying up through the still evening air. "Cattle buyers from Denver will be paying out for the whole valley's autumn drive, and Cedar Bend's little bank won't have more than that fat old sheriff and maybe 1 deputy standing between us and more money than we've seen in a year of honest thieving." "What about the townsfolk?" one of the other men asked. "Seems a mite exposed, robbing a bank in broad daylight with half the county watching." "That's why we're doing it during the harvest festival," Higgins said, a cruel smile spreading across his bearded face. "Whole town'll be gathered at the church grounds for the auction and the dance. Streets'll be empty. Bank'll be sitting there for the taking, and by the time anybody notices, we'll be 3 counties gone." Dexter's blood went cold as he listened, old anger at Higgins mixing now with a fierce, protective dread for the town that had wronged him, but that Susanna called home, the town where Dr. Sutton healed the sick, and where Susanna herself would surely be attending that very festival, unaware of the danger gathering in the hills above her. He backed away carefully from the canyon rim, his mind already racing through the implications of what he had heard. The harvest festival was in 4 days' time. He had precious little time to decide what to do with the knowledge he now carried, knowledge that could save the very town that had once tried to hang him, or that he could simply ride away from and leave to whatever fate befell it. He did not consider the second option for more than the space of a single breath. Riding hard back toward Cedar Bend as the last light faded from the sky, Dexter's thoughts turned not toward vengeance or vindication but toward Susanna, toward her father's kind, tired eyes, toward the town square where children played and old women gossiped on porches, oblivious to the danger creeping toward them from the eastern hills. Whatever debt Cedar Bend owed him, he found he could not simply let harm come to it, not when Susanna Sutton called it home. He went first to Dr. Sutton's house, arriving breathless and dust-covered, and found Susanna on the porch, her ankle fully healed now, watching the sunset with a book unopened in her lap. "Dexter," she said, rising quickly at the sight of his face, alarm replacing her initial warmth. "What has happened? I need to speak with your father, and with the sheriff, though I suspect he will not care to hear it from me." He explained quickly what he had witnessed, the names, the plan, the date of the festival looming only 4 days distant, and watched Susanna's face pale as the implications settled over her. "We must warn everyone," she said immediately. "Papa, Papa, come quickly." Dr. Sutton emerged from the house, and within minutes the three of them were hurrying toward the sheriff's office, Susanna moving quickly despite her recently healed ankle, driven by an urgency that overrode any lingering pain. They found Sheriff Barrow at his desk, boots propped up, a bottle of whiskey close at hand, and he did not rise when they entered. "What's this commotion, Doc?" Barrow asked, eyeing Dexter with obvious distaste. "And why is this drifter still lingering about my town?" "Sheriff, you must listen," Susanna said before her father could speak. "Dexter has discovered a plot to rob the bank during the harvest festival. Bart Higgins and 4 other men planning to strike while the town is gathered at the church grounds." Barrow's boots came down off the desk slowly, his expression skeptical. "Bart Higgins, Crane's old foreman, the very man who has not been seen in this valley for near 5 years." His eyes narrowed at Dexter. "And you happened to stumble upon this plot how exactly?" "I was tracking a stray calf near the eastern canyons," Dexter said evenly, refusing to be baited by the sheriff's obvious disbelief. "Heard them plotting plain as day. 5 men, well-armed, planning to strike Saturday during the festival when the streets are empty." "And I suppose you expect me to simply take the word of a man this town already convicted of theft once before," Barrow said, leaning back in his chair with a humorless smile. "Seems awfully convenient, don't it? A known thief warning us of another thief's plans. Maybe this is just your way of clearing a path for your own return to old habits." "Sheriff Barrow," Dr. Sutton said sharply, "that is quite enough. This man has given us no reason to doubt his character since he arrived in this town, only reasons to be grateful for it. I have examined my daughter's wounds and heard her account of that night on the road, and I have watched Mr. Dawson conduct himself with nothing but honesty and restraint despite considerable provocation. If he says he heard a plot to rob this town's bank, I believe him, and I think you owe this community more diligence than dismissing such a warning out of old prejudice." Barrow's face reddened, but something in the doctor's steady authority seemed to penetrate even his stubborn skepticism. "Fine," he said grudgingly. "Say I believe you, Dawson. 5 armed men against myself and 1 deputy is not odds I care to face without preparation. What would you have me do?" "Gather the men of the town who can shoot straight and keep quiet about it," Dexter said. "Do not cancel the festival, or Higgins will know his plan has been discovered and simply wait for another opportunity. Instead, Let the festival proceed as planned, but station armed men inside the bank and along the main street, hidden from view. When Higgins and his men come to rob an empty bank, they will find it is not empty at all. Barrow studied him for a long moment, old resentment warring visibly with practical necessity. "That is not a foolish plan," he admitted finally, as though the words cost him physical pain to speak. "I do not care for taking counsel from you, Dawson, but I care less for watching this town's bank get robbed blind because my pride would not allow me to listen." "Then we are agreed," Dr. Sutton said, relief evident in his voice. "Sheriff, I suggest you begin gathering trusted men immediately. We have only 4 days to prepare." The following days passed in a blur of quiet preparation, secretive meetings held in barns and back rooms, where Cedar Bend's more reliable citizens were sworn to silence, and armed with whatever rifles and revolvers they possessed. Dexter found himself, despite his outsider status, at the center of the planning, his knowledge of the canyon terrain and his first-hand account of Higgins's men proving invaluable to the defense being quietly assembled. But it was the evenings, after the planning had concluded and the town had settled into its ordinary rhythms, that Dexter treasured most, evenings spent with Susanna beside the creek where he had first camped, watching the last light fade from the sky while she asked him questions about his years of wandering, and he found himself, for the first time, imagining what it might be like to stop wandering altogether. "You are frightened," Susanna observed one evening 2 nights before the festival, watching him closely as he skipped a flat stone across the creek's dark surface. "Not of Higgins and his men, of something else." "I am frightened of what happens after," Dexter admitted, surprising himself with his own honesty. "If we stop this robbery, if the truth comes out about Higgins framing me all those years ago, what then? This town already showed me plain enough what it thinks of a stranger with no name to vouch for him. I do not know that stopping one robbery changes the character of a place." "Perhaps it does not change the whole town at once," Susanna said gently, moving closer to sit beside him on the creek bank. "But it changes something, and it has already changed me, Dexter. I do not know how to make you believe that, except to tell you plainly, I do not see the man this town once wronged when I look at you. I see a man who pulled me from beneath a wrecked buggy without a moment's hesitation, who has stayed to protect people who gave him every reason to ride away and never look back. That is the man I have come to know these past days, and that is the man I—" She paused, seeming to gather her courage. "That is the man I have come to care for, more than I know quite how to say." Dexter turned to look at her fully then, the last light of evening catching in her dark hair, her eyes searching his with a vulnerability that mirrored his own. "Susanna," he said quietly, "I have spent 6 years believing I would never again find a place where I belonged, or a person who might look at me without judgment weighing down her eyes. I did not expect to find both in the very town that once tried to hang me." "Then perhaps," she said softly, "this town owes you a great deal more than it ever imagined." He reached out then tentatively and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his rough fingers gentle against her cheek. "I care for you too, Susanna, more than I rightly know how to put into words, but I would not have you burdened with my troubles, not when this town might yet turn against me again once Higgins is dealt with. Let me worry about this town," she said, leaning into his touch. "You have spent 6 years carrying burdens alone that were never rightfully yours to carry. Let someone share the weight of it now." He kissed her then, softly, hesitantly at first, as though half expecting the moment to shatter like brittle glass, but she met him with equal tenderness, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, and for a long moment the coming danger, the old grievances, the uncertain future, all of it fell away, leaving only the quiet creek and the deepening twilight and the certainty, unspoken but keenly felt, that they had found something rare and worth protecting in each other. The morning of the harvest festival dawned clear and bright, the kind of golden autumn day that made Cedar Bend's valley look like something painted onto canvas, the aspens blazing gold against the deep green of the pines, the sky a flawless, endless blue. The town square filled early with families arriving in wagons and on horseback, their finest clothes brushed clean for the occasion, children racing between the booths where local farmers displayed their prize vegetables and preserves for the annual auction. Behind the festive facade, however, a careful defense had been assembled. 6 of the town's most reliable men, including the blacksmith Otis Greer, who had come to Dexter privately the night before to offer a stammering, awkward apology for his part in the events of 6 years past, were stationed at various points along the main street, their rifles concealed but ready. 2 more waited inside the bank itself, alongside the nervous young banker, Mr. Aldridge, who had reluctantly agreed to keep the vault's contents visible enough to draw the robbers in without arousing suspicion. Dexter himself had taken a position atop the roof of the mercantile, a vantage point that gave him clear sight lines down both the main street and the alley behind the bank, the most likely approach for men wishing to avoid the festival crowds. Sheriff Barrow, despite his lingering distrust, had grudgingly accepted the tactical wisdom of Dexter's positioning and had stationed himself inside the sheriff's office, ready to move the moment trouble began. Susanna had wanted to stay near the bank, insisting she could serve as a lookout as well as any man, but her father had firmly overruled her, and she had reluctantly agreed to remain at the church grounds with the festival crowd, close enough to reach her father's medical supplies quickly should anyone be wounded, but far enough from the danger to ease Dexter's worried mind, at least somewhat. The morning passed with agonizing slowness, the festival's cheerful noise a strange counterpoint to the tension coiled tight in Dexter's chest as he watched the empty street below, his rifle resting across his knees, sweat beading beneath his hatband despite the cool autumn air. It was nearly noon, the auction in full swing at the church grounds, laughter and music drifting faintly on the breeze, when Dexter finally spotted movement in the alley behind the bank. 5 riders, moving with the deliberate quiet of men accustomed to avoiding notice, dismounting a block from the bank and approaching on foot, rifles held low but ready. Dexter recognized Bart Higgins immediately, older and harder than the man he remembered, but unmistakable nonetheless, his face set in the same calculating expression Dexter had glimpsed across that canyon campfire days before. Dexter raised 2 fingers, the signal he had arranged with the men below, and watched Otis Greer, stationed near the barber shop, pass the signal further down the line. Within moments, the trap was set, every armed man in position, waiting only for Higgins and his men to commit fully to their robbery before springing the ambush. Higgins approached the bank's front door with 2 of his men, while the other 3 moved toward the rear entrance, exactly as Dexter had predicted from his knowledge of the building's layout. The young banker, Aldridge, met them with admirable composure, allowing Higgins to believe the bank was undefended even as the robbers filed inside toward the vault, their rifles drawn, their attention fixed entirely on the money they believed themselves about to steal. "Nobody moves and nobody gets hurt," Higgins announced, his voice carrying out through the open door and up to where Dexter watched from the mercantile roof. "Open that vault, banker, and be quick about it." That was the moment Dexter had been waiting for. He raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the air, the signal for the ambush to spring, and immediately the quiet street erupted into chaos as the hidden defenders revealed themselves, rifles leveled at the bank's doors and windows from every angle. "Higgins!" Sheriff Barrow's voice boomed out as he emerged from his office, revolver drawn, flanked by 2 armed deputies. "You are surrounded. Drop your weapons and come out with your hands raised." For a tense moment, silence held the street in its grip, and Dexter's heart hammered against his ribs as he waited to see whether Higgins would surrender or fight. Then a shot rang out from inside the bank, splintering the doorframe, and the ambush erupted into violence. Dexter fired down into the alley where 2 of Higgins's men had attempted to flee toward their horses, his shots deliberately aimed to disable rather than kill, striking one man in the shoulder and sending the other diving for cover behind a water trough. Below in the street, Otis Greer and the other townsmen had pinned down the remaining robbers with a hail of covering fire, and within minutes, the brief, chaotic battle had turned decisively against Higgins and his gang. It was Higgins himself who made the final, desperate break, bursting from the bank's rear door with a sack of money clutched in one hand and his revolver in the other, sprinting toward the alley where his horse waited. Dexter, seeing his chance to finally settle 6 years of injustice, leaped from the mercantile roof onto the awning below and dropped into the alley directly in Higgins's path. "That's far enough, Higgins," Dexter said, his rifle leveled steady despite the pounding of his own heart. "Drop the money and the gun, it is over." Higgins skidded to a stop, his eyes widening with recognition as he registered the face before him. "Dawson, I'll be damned. They hanged you 6 years ago and here you are, still causing me grief." "They never hanged me, though it was not for lack of trying," Dexter said. "And I have you to thank for that particular ordeal, don't I? Framing me for Crane's stallions to cover your own thieving." "Prove it," Higgins spat, though his gun hand had begun to tremble slightly, sweat beading on his brow as he realized his escape route was thoroughly blocked. "Nobody's ever going to believe a wanted outlaw over a respectable drifter's word, no matter which one of us is telling the truth." "I do not need you to confess," Dexter said calmly. "The sheriff and half this town just watched you rob a bank in broad daylight. That is enough to see you hanged properly this time, with a rope that has your name on it instead of mine. But if you want to make things easier on yourself when the judge hears your case, you might consider admitting to what you did 6 years back. Might be the difference between hanging and simply spending the rest of your days in a territorial prison." Higgins's face twisted with a mixture of fear and grudging calculation, and for a long moment Dexter thought he might simply raise his revolver and force the issue to its violent conclusion. But then Sheriff Barrow arrived at the alley's entrance with 3 armed deputies, and Higgins's shoulders sagged with the recognition that his options had narrowed to nothing. "All right," Higgins said bitterly, letting the money sack fall to the dirt and raising his hand slowly. "All right, damn you. I took those stallions 6 years back. Sold them to a buyer up in Cheyenne for near $200, and when Crane started asking questions, I pointed him toward the first stranger I could find to take the blame instead of me. Wasn't personal, Dawson, just business." "It was plenty personal to me," Dexter said quietly, lowering his rifle as Barrow's deputies moved in to secure Higgins's hands with iron cuffs. "6 years of my life, spent running from a lie you told to save your own skin." Sheriff Barrow approached slowly, his expression unreadable as he looked between Dexter and the now restrained Higgins. "You heard that confession same as I did," he said finally, and there was something almost like shame in his voice, an acknowledgement 6 years overdue. "Seems this town owes you an apology considerably larger than the one I am about to give, Dawson, and I intend to see that it is paid, publicly and properly." Within the hour, the entire captured gang had been secured in the town jail, their wounds tended by Dr. Sutton, who worked with the same careful compassion he would have shown any patient regardless of their crimes. The festival crowd had gathered at the edge of the main street, drawn by the commotion, and word of what had transpired, of Higgins's confession, of the truth finally spoken aloud after 6 long years, spread through Cedar Bend like wildfire through dry grass. Susanna found Dexter standing alone near the bank, still holding his rifle loosely at his side, watching the aftermath with an expression caught somewhere between relief and disbelief. She ran to him without a moment's hesitation, throwing her arms around his neck heedless of the gathered crowd's watching eyes. "You did it," she said, tears bright in her eyes. "You saved the town and you cleared your name both in the same breath." "We did it," he corrected gently, holding her close, the rifle now forgotten at his feet. "You and your father and even that stubborn old sheriff. I could not have done it alone, Susanna." "Dexter Dawson." Sheriff Barrow's voice cut through the moment, and Dexter turned to find the sheriff standing before him, hat in hand, an expression of genuine humility replacing his customary gruffness. "I owe you an apology that is 6 years overdue, and I intend to give it properly in front of the whole town if you will allow me the chance." "I would like that," Dexter said quietly, "though I never much cared for speeches made at my expense." Barrow managed something like a rueful smile. "This one will be different, I promise you that." That evening, as the harvest festival resumed with considerably more relief than its earlier tension had allowed, Sheriff Barrow climbed atop a wagon bed in the center of town square and called for the crowd's attention. Dexter stood near the back, uncertain and slightly embarrassed by the gathering focus, with Susanna's hand held firmly in his own. "6 years ago," Barrow began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed crowd, "this town wronged a young man named Dexter Dawson. We accused him of a crime he did not commit, beat him, and drove him from our midst with threats against his very life, all because it was easier to blame a stranger than to look closely at one of our own. Today, that same man returned to this town not seeking revenge, but bringing warning of a very real danger, and when we might have turned him away again out of old prejudice, he stayed anyway and helped save this town from a robbery that could have ruined half the families gathered here tonight." Barrow paused, removing his hat entirely and holding it against his chest. "I was wrong 6 years ago, and I have been slow to admit it since his return. Dexter Dawson, on behalf of this town, I offer you my sincerest apology, and I hope you might find it in your heart to forgive an old fool who let his pride outweigh his sense." A murmur passed through the crowd, and one by one, faces that Dexter remembered from that terrible day 6 years past began to step forward, Otis Greer among the first, his weathered hands twisting his hat brim nervously. "I held you down while others struck you," Otis said, his voice thick with shame. "I have regretted it every day since, though I never had the courage to say so until now. I am sorry, Dawson, truly sorry." Others followed, the mercantile owner's wife offering a tearful apology for her cruelty, an old rancher admitting he had known even then that the accusation against Dexter had seemed thin and poorly reasoned, but had said nothing out of cowardice. The apologies continued for the better part of an hour, and though Dexter accepted each one with quiet grace, it was Susanna's hand in his that steadied him through the overwhelming tide of long-delayed contrition. "You do not have to forgive them all at once," she whispered to him as the crowd finally began to disperse toward the remaining festival festivities. "Some wounds take time to heal properly." "I know," he said, watching the town he had once fled in shame and terror now offering him a place among them, however belatedly. "But I find I do not want to carry the old bitterness any longer, Susanna, not when I have found something here worth staying for." She looked up at him, understanding passing between them without need for further words, and when he knelt suddenly before her, right there in the town square with the last light of the harvest festival glowing warm around them, she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Susanna Sutton," Dexter said, his voice rough with emotion he had rarely allowed himself to show, "6 years ago, this town taught me that a man could be broken by cruelty and injustice, that a stranger's word counted for nothing against the weight of prejudice and fear. But these past weeks, you have taught me something else entirely, that kindness given freely can heal even the deepest wounds, that a man might find not just forgiveness but love in the very place that once cast him out. I do not have much to offer you, no grand ranch, no fortune, only a horse, a rifle, and a heart that has finally, after all these years of wandering, found somewhere it wants to stay. Would you do me the tremendous honor of becoming my wife?" Tears streamed freely down Susanna's face now, and she sank to her knees before him, taking his weathered hands in both of hers. "Dexter Dawson," she said, her voice trembling with joy, "I have never wanted anything so much in my entire life as I want to be your wife. Yes, 1,000 times yes." The crowd that remained, having witnessed the entire exchange, erupted into cheers and applause, and Dr. Sutton, who had been standing nearby with tears of his own shining in his eyes, moved forward to embrace them both. "Well," the doctor said, laughing through his tears, "I suppose I shall be gaining a son-in-law considerably sooner than I had anticipated, though I cannot imagine a finer man for my daughter to have chosen." Dexter rose and lifted Susanna into his arms, spinning her once beneath the darkening sky as the first stars began to emerge, and the sound of her laughter, bright and unguarded and utterly joyful, seemed to Dexter like the sweetest music he had ever heard, sweeter even than the fiddle music still drifting from the church grounds, where the festival dance continued undisturbed by all that had transpired that remarkable day. They were married 3 weeks later, on a crisp autumn morning with the aspens still holding their golden leaves against a brilliant blue sky, in the same church whose preacher had once intervened to save Dexter's life 6 years before. The old preacher, now considerably grayer but still possessed of the same gentle wisdom, presided over the ceremony with evident joy, remarking to the gathered congregation that he had never imagined the frightened young man he had once pulled from an angry mob's grasp would return to marry the doctor's beloved daughter in the very same town square. The wedding was attended by nearly the entire population of Cedar Bend, a testament to how thoroughly the town's sentiment had shifted in the weeks since Higgins's capture and confession. Sheriff Barrow himself stood as an unlikely witness to the vows, having become, in the intervening weeks, something of an unexpected friend to Dexter, the two men bonding over the shared work of rebuilding trust between the town and the drifter it had once wronged. Silas Crane himself, informed of Higgins's confession and deeply ashamed of his role in the original injustice, had arrived at the wedding bearing an unexpected gift, the deed to a modest parcel of land at the valley's edge, complete with a small but sturdy cabin and enough grazing land to support a respectable herd of cattle. "It is not enough to undo 6 years of wrongful exile," Crane had said gruffly, pressing the deed into Dexter's hands before the ceremony began, "but I hope you will accept it as a start toward the debt I owe you, Dawson. My foreman's lies cost you dearly, and I was too quick to believe the easy answer rather than question a man I had trusted for years. I am sorry for the part I played in your suffering, and I hope this land might help you build the life you deserve." Dexter had accepted the gift with quiet gratitude, understanding that some debts, however large, could never be fully repaid, but that the effort to repay them mattered nonetheless. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt, Susanna radiant in a gown of pale blue that her father had commissioned from Denver for the occasion. Dexter cleaned up and dressed in a new suit that felt foreign against his skin after years of range clothes and trail dust, but that he wore proudly nonetheless as he watched his bride walk toward him down the small church aisle. "Do you, Dexter Dawson, take this woman to be your lawful wife, to love and cherish, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Dexter said, his voice steady despite the tremendous emotion swelling in his chest, and when he looked into Susanna's eyes, he saw reflected there the same certainty, the same profound gratitude for a chance encounter on a lonely road that had led them both to this moment. "And do you, Susanna Sutton, take this man to be your lawful husband, to love and cherish, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Susanna answered, her voice clear and joyful, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted into applause and cheerful shouts, the very same townspeople who had once cast Dexter out now celebrating his union with the woman he loved as though it were their own triumph as much as his. The years that followed unfolded with the steady, contented rhythm of a life well built on love and mutual respect. Dexter and Susanna settled into the small cabin Silas Crane had gifted them, and through hard work and careful management, they built it into a modest but thriving ranch over the following seasons, running cattle across the valley's rich grasslands and gradually expanding their holdings as their fortunes improved. Dexter took on the role of deputy sheriff alongside Barrow within the first year of their marriage, a position that would have seemed impossible only months before. But that felt entirely natural given how thoroughly the town had come to trust and rely upon his steady presence. Together, he and Barrow worked to ensure that Cedar Bend never again fell prey to the kind of hasty judgment and prejudice that had once nearly cost Dexter his life, establishing more careful procedures for investigating accusations and insisting upon proper evidence before any man was condemned by rumor alone. Susanna, for her part, continued assisting her father with his medical practice, even as she managed the growing responsibilities of the ranch. And within 2 years, they had saved enough between them to help fund the construction of the small hospital her father had always dreamed of building, a modest but well-equipped building that would serve the entire valley's medical needs for generations to come. Their first child, a son they named Samuel after Dexter's own long-deceased father, arrived in the spring of 1883, born in the very hospital his grandfather had helped establish, and Dexter wept openly the first time he held his son in his arms, overwhelmed by the profound joy of a family he had once believed himself destined never to have. "He has your eyes," Susanna said softly, watching her husband cradle their newborn son with a tenderness that belied his rugged, weathered hands. "I hope he has your kindness," Dexter replied, his voice thick with emotion. "The world could use considerably more of that than it has of my stubbornness." 2 years later, their daughter Alina arrived, followed 3 years after that by a second son named Cole, in honor of Sheriff Barrow, who had become something of an adoptive grandfather to the growing family in the years since his initial apology had opened the door to genuine friendship. Barrow, who had never married nor had children of his own, doted on the Dawson children with an affection that surprised everyone who remembered his gruff, unyielding demeanor from years past, teaching young Samuel to ride and shoot with the same patient care he might have shown a son of his own blood. Bart Higgins, tried and convicted for the attempted bank robbery, received a lengthy sentence in the territorial prison, though his confession regarding the stolen stallions 6 years prior was formally entered into the county record, permanently clearing Dexter's name of any lingering suspicion. Silas Crane, in the years that followed, became something of an unlikely ally to Dexter and Susanna, his initial guilt over the injustice gradually transforming into genuine friendship as their family's fortunes remained intertwined through shared business dealings and mutual respect. The town of Cedar Bend itself grew and prospered in the years following the failed robbery, its population swelling as word spread of the valley's rich grazing lands and the community's evident commitment to fairness and justice, a reputation earned largely through the very public reckoning that had followed Dexter's return. A new street running past the small hospital was eventually named Dawson Lane, a quiet but permanent acknowledgement of the debt the town owed to the drifter it had once cast out. On a warm evening in the summer of 1889, nearly 8 years after that fateful day when Dexter Dawson had first heard a woman's scream carried on the wind and turned his horse toward trouble rather than away from it, the entire family gathered on the porch of their ranch house to watch the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Samuel, now 6 years old, chased his younger sister Alina across the yard, while baby Cole slept peacefully in his mother's arms, and Dexter stood beside Susanna, his arm wrapped around her waist, watching the golden light settle over the valley they had built their lives within. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Susanna asked quietly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "If you had simply ridden past that gully without stopping?" "Every day," Dexter admitted, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I think about how close I came to riding on toward the mining camps, how easily I might have missed hearing you call for help at all. But I did not ride on, and I did hear you, and I have thanked whatever providence guided me down that particular road every single day since. This town owes you everything, Susanna said softly. Not just the bank, not just Higgins's capture. You gave Cedar Bend a chance to become something better than it had been, something more just and more kind. That is no small gift, Dexter. I did not do it alone, he reminded her, as he had told her so many times before. I did it because you showed me that kindness given freely without expectation of reward can heal wounds that seemed impossible to mend. You saved me just as surely as I ever saved this town, Susanna, perhaps more surely. She turned in his embrace to look up at him, her eyes bright with love undimmed by the years that had passed since their first meeting on that lonely stretch of road. Then I suppose we saved each other, she said, smiling. I suppose we did, Dexter agreed, and as their children's laughter drifted across the yard and the last light of the summer sun faded gently into a sky brilliant with emerging stars, he pulled his wife close and kissed her softly, grateful beyond measure for the strange, winding path that had carried him from a town's cruel rejection to this quiet, abundant happiness he had once believed himself entirely unworthy of ever finding. The drifter who had once been driven from Cedar Bend with stones and curses had returned to become one of its most beloved citizens, his kindness to a single stranger on a lonely road ultimately saving the entire town from ruin, and in the process, finding for himself the home, the family, and the love that 6 long years of wandering had never quite managed to extinguish from his hopeful, enduring heart.